Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, filter out all the noise, and really just deliver the specific targeted knowledge you need.
We're here for those aha moments.
Exactly, the surprising facts that kind of turn history on its head.
And today, we are stripping away, 2,000 years of bad press, opera, and golden Hollywood romance?
Yeah, we're not here to talk about a tragic love story.
Not at all. We are sailing straight into a fierce, intellectual, and frankly, a geopolitical confrontation that really determined the entire course of Western history.
Absolutely. When you hear the name Cleopatra, your mind, it immediately goes to the glamour, right? The elaborate gold jewelry, maybe the Elizabeth Taylor movie.
The snakes, the bards.
Right, the whole cinematic myth of a seductress. But that image is, well, it's a historical distortion that actively minimizes the greatest political mind of her era.
It doesn't just minimize her, it actively obscures her genius. I mean, our sources make it abundantly clear. The real Cleopatra VII wasn't a footnote in some Roman general's biography.
Yeah.
She was a polyglot, a seasoned naval commander, a true intellectual who trained in the top academic centers of her time, and, most importantly, a ruthless political strategist operating with, zero margin for error.
Okay, let's unpack this setup, because the context here is absolutely everything. We are heading directly to the mouth of the Nile, to the year 51 BCE.
It's a pressure cooker.
A total pressure cooker. We are looking at the definitive end of the 3,000-year era of the Pharaohs. The glorious Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great, is, well, it's crumbling around her.
And you should think of it less like a slow fade and more like watching a magnificent ancient skyscraper that is just structurally failing under its own weight.
That's a great way to put it.
It's wealthy on the surface, it has all the gold in the grain, but internally it's fractured and politically just incredibly unstable. This is the hand Cleopatra was dealt at age 18.
And the threat isn't just internal squabbling, it's existential. To the north, you have this rising shadow of Rome.
Looming over everything.
Rome is no longer just a republic. It is an emerging global hegemon, relentlessly swallowing independent nations and turning them into profit-generating provinces.
They had already consumed Greece, Anatolia, vast parts of North Africa. Egypt, with its unparalleled wealth and, critically, its massive grain supply, was the last major piece on the chessboard.
The ultimate prize.
It was the prize Rome desperately needed, but for a variety of political reasons, couldn't just openly take. Not yet.
So the mission for us today in this deep dive is to understand how one woman, using basically only her intellect and her ability to generate soft power, stood between her ancient country and total annexation by this overwhelming military force.
And that defines our entire deep dive. Her fight wasn't a traditional war fought with legions. She couldn't win that. It was a strategic war to save Egypt, using her academic prowess and her soft power as her primary weapons of choice.
So she's aiming for survival through alliance and persuasion, not just brute force.
Precisely. Not direct military confrontation.
Yeah.
She knew she'd lose that fight every single time.
And that distinction intellect over infantry is what makes her story so incredibly relevant even today. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the ancient world, that in an era of rapidly shifting global dynamics, knowledge and communication were the ultimate forms of geopolitical currency.
And that is exactly why we have to start this story, not by looking at her palace or her lovers, but at her school.
Now, to truly appreciate the strategic arsenal Cleopatra possessed, we have to start with the environment that forged her, the city of Alexandria. This wasn't just her capital.
No.
It was her intellectual foundation, and she turned it into a weapon.
But before we even get into her education, let's reset the timeline, because this is where a lot of modern listeners, they get confused. When Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, the Great Pyramids were already incredibly ancient.
Right, they weren't new.
Not at all. They were about 2,500 years old. They were already monuments of an age-long past, basically tourist attractions for her ancestors.
That context is vital. This was not the monolithic, unified Egypt of Tutankhamun. This was a sophisticated, complex, what did the sources call it? A Greek-Egyptian hybrid world.
Exactly. The Ptolemies, her family, were Macedonian Greeks who inherited the throne after Alexander the Great's death. So, for all intents and purposes, they were foreign rulers who controlled Egypt.
And they acted like it for the most part.
For centuries, yes. And this hybrid culture is the key to understanding Cleopatra's unique power. For almost 300 years, her family line had maintained their Greek identity, their Greek language, their Greek administration, and they often treated the native Egyptian population and their ancient culture with well, with disdain.
They were cultural outsiders.
Complete cultural outsiders ruling a land of profound antiquity.
So here's where it gets really interesting, and it speaks volumes about her strategic vision right from the start. Cleopatra was the very first in her entire Macedonian Greek family, the Ptolemies, to actually commit to learning the Egyptian language.
Think about the political magnitude of that act.
Yeah.
Just stop and think about that. It wasn't a mere gesture or hobby.
No, it was a power move.
It was a massive power move. For the Egyptian priesthood and the native populace who held immense spiritual and cultural power, this was a profound, necessary statement of legitimacy. By speaking Egyptian, she was saying, I am not just a Greek occupier, I understand and I respect the very foundation of this land.
She was shoring up her domestic base.
Consolidating internal support at a time when the dynasty was collapsing internally. But her education went far, far beyond just mastering the vernacular. The sources stress she was not some princess just waiting for a husband. She was an active student of the highest possible caliber.
Absolutely. She spent her time in the intellectual powerhouses of the entire known world. The Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, and the legendary Great Library of Alexandria. And these weren't, dusty archives. They were what we would call a modern research university, a series of think tanks and academic publishing houses all rolled into one incredible campus.
The brightest minds from all over the Mediterranean were there. Mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, poets. It was the Silicon Valley of its day, but for intellectual capital.
So what exactly did she study there that was so crucial to her later political strategy?
The sources point explicitly to three things: philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. And these were not ornamental studies for a young princess.
These were practical skills.
Incredibly practical. Philosophy taught her critical thinking and the formation of robust political theory. It's how you learn to see the world not just as it is, but how it could be structured.
And mathematics.
Well, mathematics, specifically geometry and astronomical calculations, was essential for administering a vast agricultural state. Her entire economy depended on the Nile's predictable yet very complex floods. Managing that required a deep understanding of logistics, surveying, and finance.
But the mastery of rhetoric, that feels like the true weapon she would eventually deploy against Rome.
That's the one. Precisely. Hellenistic rhetoric wasn't just public speaking. It was an entire field of psychological warfare and persuasion. We're talking about systems developed by figures like Aristotle. She mastered the three pillars: logos.
The appeal to logic and reason.
Exactly. Then pathos.
Appealing to emotion and passion.
Right. And finally, ethos, which is all about establishing your personal credibility and authority.
So when she's eventually speaking to someone like Julius Caesar, she isn't just trying to charm him, she's calculating the exact balance of these things.
She's running a diagnostic. She's thinking, okay, with this man, I need 70% logos, which is Egypt's essential grain supply, 20% pathos, the emotional drama of her current exile and her dynastic rights, and 10% echoes my own bearing as a queen. She's constantly adjusting the formula.
It was intellectual chess.
It was. She used structured argumentation to transform herself, in Caesar's eyes, from a desperate, exiled queen into an absolutely indispensable strategic ally. Her intellectual training gave her the capacity to analyze Roman interests and present Egyptian wealth as the only logical solution to Rome's biggest logistical problems.
And then we get to the linguistic skill, which, I still find this astonishing. She reportedly spoke 9 languages.
9. In the ancient world, that is almost unheard of for a head of state. Most rulers communicated only in Greek or maybe Latin and relied entirely on translators for everything else.
And every translator is a weak link.
Every translator is a potential point of failure, misinterpretation, or even espionage. The strategic implications of this are revolutionary. For centuries, the Ptolemies have been forced to rely on intermediaries to manage diplomacy with neighboring cultures: the Hebrews, the Arabs, the Medes, the Ethiopians.
That she could just walk into a room and talk to them.
Directly. She eliminated the translator. She revolutionized her own foreign policy. If she was negotiating a trade route with an Arab sheikh, or discussing the taxation of the very powerful Jewish community in Alexandria, she spoke directly to them in their native tongue.
You can't overstate the advantage that gives you.
It creates an instant rapport and a sense of trust that no translated negotiation can ever replicate. It allows a diplomat to hear the nuances, the subtext, the subtle implications that are always lost when filtered through a third party. This linguistic mastery was the ultimate expression of her soft power before she even met a single Roman.
So when the sources refer to her ancient wisdom, they're underlining the fact that this power wasn't just mystical or purely divine, even though she definitely cultivated that image later on.
Oh, she leaned into that hard.
But fundamentally, it was academic and strategic, derived from the most advanced centers of learning on the planet. She truly weaponized knowledge itself.
It did.
Now, we move to the first great application of that intellectual arsenal, her critical encounter with Julius Caesar. The context here is brutal. It's life or death. Egypt was undeniably wealthy, overflowing with grain, gold, agricultural capacity. But politically, it was weak. And that combination made it the perfect target.
And as we mentioned, Cleopatra herself was already in a deep crisis. Her younger brother, Ptolemy III, who was co-ruler but essentially a puppet for an influential faction of courtiers, had successfully exiled her. She was a queen without a kingdom, a refugee on her own borders,
Just waiting for her moment.
looking for an opening.
And the catalyst for everything changes when Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria in 48 BCE. He wasn't there to conquer Egypt. Not yet, anyway.
No, he was there because he was pursuing Pompey the Great, his main rival in the Roman Civil War. The problem was Pompey was assassinated by Ptolemy's faction just before Caesar arrived, which was a major miscalculation on their part. Caesar was furious.
So Cleopatra, who is exiled and observing this sudden arrival of the world's most powerful Roman general, faced this unique and terrifying dilemma. If she arrived openly at the palace, she'd be intercepted and probably killed by her brother's faction.
She'd never make it through the front door.
She needed to bypass protocol, security, and all the politics and force an immediate audience with Caesar.
And this is where the romance of the rug legend begins. We've all heard it right. She was smuggled into the general's quarters, rolled up inside a linen sack or a laundry bag, maybe a coiled carpet.
And while the image is just ripe for Hollywood,
It's a great scene.
the expert analysis in our sources demands we move past the romance and focus on the strategic intent. This was not a cute, charming gesture designed to elicit romantic attention.
No, this was, as one source put it, a desperate, brilliant military maneuver.
I mean, think about the sheer audacious risk, the guts of that move. She was infiltrating the residence of a foreign general, bypassing dozens of guards loyal to her brother, knowing that if she was caught, she would be executed on the spot.
It was pure shock and theatricality, designed to maximize immediate, unavoidable leverage. She knew Caesar, a man who appreciated bold moves.
By appearing unannounced and, crucially, alive in Caesar's private chambers, she forced the world's most powerful man to immediately recognize her sovereignty and deal with her. She completely dictated the terms of that first meeting simply by virtue of the shock effect.
She shifted the entire narrative in one move, from exiled beggar queen to sovereign-forcing negotiation.
And we know, based on the historical outcome, that she then deployed her rhetorical training perfectly. She convinced a man who was, at first, inclined to support her brother's faction to instead back her claim to the throne.
The relationship that came out of that was fundamentally transactional. It was driven by high geopolitics and mutual necessity, not some starry-eyed infatuation. It was built on the exchange of grain and gold for swords.
Let's break that down, that exchange. Why did Rome, the global powerhouse, desperately need Egyptian grain?
Because Rome was an enormous, sprawling urban center, and its legions were massive mobile entities that were constantly on the move. Feeding the city and the army required an unprecedented, constant supply of foodstuffs, particularly grain.
And Egypt was the breadbasket.
It was the most reliable and prolific grain producer in the entire Mediterranean. The Nile Valley's annual flood cycle made it a sure thing. So, controlling the Egyptian grain supply was synonymous with political stability in Rome itself. If the grain shipments stopped, the Roman populace starved, and riots would break out in the Forum. Caesar desperately needed Egypt's logistical stability to secure his own power.
So Caesar was essentially trading his immediate, overwhelming military strength, his swords, to secure the stability of his own power base back in Rome. It was a strategic marriage of necessity.
Absolutely. Cleopatra needed the legions to defeat her brother and secure her throne, and Caesar needed Egyptian resources to secure Rome. It was a perfect symbiotic alliance.
And she understood that merely securing her throne wasn't enough. The Roman threat wouldn't just disappear simply because she was allied with Caesar. She needed a permanent political solution, a way to anchor Egypt inextricably to Rome's future.
She needed to make them family.
Exactly. That anchor was the birth of her son, Caesarion. This move was one of staggering political ambition that had global implications.
It was a gamble aimed at completely dissolving the division between East and West. by bearing a son to Julius Caesar, a man who was already hinting at divine status and acting like a King Cleopatra wasn't just securing an heir for Egypt.
No, she was attempting to establish a new, combined Greco-Roman dynasty.
Imagine the vision. If Caesarion, the son of the quasi-divine Julius Caesar, and the Pharaoh Cleopatra could rise to power, the Ptolemaic future would be secured through a joint Roman-Egyptian empire.
It essentially meant Egypt would be protected from annexation forever because its royal line would be the Roman royal line.
It's an incredible high-stakes bet, but it was also one that absolutely terrified the traditionalist Roman Senate. They had no interest in seeing an Eastern queen's son inherit the Republic. This ambition would eventually become the central justification for Octavian's war against her.
So Caesarion was less a child and more an unbearable political statement.
An existential threat to the Roman way of life, at least in the eyes of the Senate.
That audacious bet paid off initially, securing her throne and giving her a measure of Roman protection. But as we know, the political foundation was just ripped away almost immediately with the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE.
And the world plunged right back into chaos. The assassination created this massive power vacuum, and Rome was carved up by the rival generals and political figures who all saw themselves as Caesar's rightful successor.
This is when the second critical Roman figure enters her life, Mark Antony. And we have to take a moment to contrast Antony with Caesar because she had to completely pivot her strategic approach. This was a different kind of man.
A whole different ballgame. If Julius Caesar was the calculating, pragmatic, intellectual brain of Rome, then Mark Antony was undeniably its military muscle and its volatile, passionate heart.
He was a soldier's soldier.
He was. Antony was a brilliant general, beloved by his troops, but he lacked Caesar's nuanced political control and his intellectual detachment. He was driven by loyalty, honor, and raw, naked ambition.
And Cleopatra knew she couldn't approach Antony with the same cold, hard logic she used on Caesar.
That wouldn't work.
She needed a new strategy, leveraging her divine identity and her country's sensory, incomparable wealth.
The sources are just fascinating here. She doubled down on the idea that she was the living reincarnation of the Egyptian goddess Isis.
Why Isis specifically? What was the strategic value there?
Because Isis was a profoundly powerful figure goddess of motherhood, magic, and rebirth. But more than that, Isis appealed both to her native Egyptian subjects, which validated her legitimacy as pharaoh, and critically, Isis cults were wildly popular throughout the Hellenistic world and were even growing in Rome.
So it was an identity that transcended borders.
Exactly. By embodying Isis, Cleopatra elevated herself beyond a mere human queen and into a divine entity. She wasn't just offering Antony a military alliance, she was offering partnership with a living deity, which gave her an authority that far exceeded that of any human Roman magistrate.
And she put this divinity and wealth on full, dazzling display during the most famous meeting of her life, the encounter with Mark Antony at Tarsus in 41 BCE.
This was the ultimate demonstration of soft power, weaponized with sensory overload.
The details of this meeting are immortalized in historical accounts because they were just so overwhelming. She didn't bother with normal diplomatic protocol. She arrived not on a simple state ship, but on a magnificent barge that essentially transformed the entire meeting into sacred theater.
It was a performance.
Yeah.
A carefully staged masterpiece of propaganda.
So let's focus on the specific memorable visual details, because they weren't just decorative. They were strategic symbols of unimaginable wealth. We know the barge had purple sails.
And you have to understand, purple dye was so incredibly expensive, derived from thousands of tiny sea mollusks, that it was literally reserved for royalty. It was a visible statement of monopoly wealth that no Roman could match.
And it was powered by silver oars.
Silver oars, not bronze or wood. I mean, can you imagine those oars flashing rhythmically in the sunlight? It's visually demonstrating that Egypt could afford to power its transport with precious metal. The entire atmosphere was designed to be intoxicating and, frankly, intimidating.
And the sensory experience was intentional too. There are reports that the scent of exotic perfumes and burning incense emanating from the barge could be smelled far down the river, even before the ship was visible.
She was literally announcing her presence to every port and every Roman official with a wave of luxury that just screamed, "We operate on a completely different financial plane."
So what was the message behind all this extravagance besides just, I am very, very rich?
The message was a masterclass in soft power negotiation. She was deliberately showing Antony that Rome commanded legions in metal, yes, but Egypt possessed incomparable, ancient financial and divine might.
This time she wasn't begging for protection.
Not at all. She was offering a partnership between a powerful military machine and an inexhaustible financial treasury. She completely flipped the dynamic.
She was essentially saying, "You, Antony, possess the necessary brute force to lead the West, but we, Egypt, possess the wealth, the logistics, and the sacred divine right to anchor the East."
And that legitimacy, stretching back thousands of years, was the intangible asset that Rome lacked. Antony, who was hungry for glory and looking for an answer to his rival Octavian, fell completely under the sway of this intoxicating vision.
This partnership solidified, evolving into more than just a military pact. It culminated in the formation of their famous joint social group, the Inimitable Livers.
The name itself, amidobioi in Greek, which roughly means those whose lives are unsurpassable, was a deliberate cultural challenge to the entire established Roman order.
How was a social club a political weapon? It sounds like they were just partying.
Well, because in Rome, the highest virtue was virtus, the manly quality of austerity, public service, and duty, or pietas. The Senate championed modesty and restrained behavior.
And this club was not that.
It was the exact antithesis. It was dedicated to Hellenistic luxury, philosophy, and collective power. They would host these famously lavish dinner parties where the only rule was to challenge the limits of opulence and philosophical discussion. It was a fusion of power and pleasure that was deeply un-Roman.
So they weren't just having fun. They were creating a countercultural, counter-political movement. They were defining their own new global standard, one that placed intellectual life and consolidated authority above the strict puritanical traditions of the Roman Republic.
Exactly. And for Octavian, back in Rome, this club proved everything he needed. It was perfect propaganda material. It showed that Antony had abandoned Roman gravitas for Eastern decadence. It was intellectual alignment and strategic partnership, but it was packaged in a way that gave Octavian all the ammunition he needed to destroy their joint dream.
The power peak of Antony and Cleopatra was extraordinary. I mean, they controlled vast swaths of the Eastern Mediterranean, backed by the wealth of Egypt and Antony's formidable legion.
They were the ultimate power couple.
But that glorious dream, the concept of a combined Egyptian-Roman empire, was deemed utterly intolerable by Rome's established elite, and especially by Octavian.
This is where we see the final, decisive confrontation shift entirely from the physical battlefield to the battle for image and public perception. Octavian understood he couldn't just defeat Antony purely on military grounds. Antony was too good a general and too beloved by his men.
So he had to destroy his reputation first.
He had to destroy Cleopatra's reputation and Antony's legitimacy. He launched one of the most effective and vicious propaganda wars in history.
And crucially, Octavian was careful not to declare war on Mark Antony.
A revered fellow Roman general. You couldn't do that.
He declared war directly on Cleopatra.
And this was a masterful move, rhetorically speaking. It allowed him to frame the entire conflict not as another messy Roman civil war, which people were tired of, but as a fight for the purity and survival of Rome against a dangerous external enemy.
He successfully painted Cleopatra as the ultimate threat, a foreign enchantress, a drunken, decadent Eastern queen who had bewitched Antony and was trying to steal Rome's rightful provinces.
This propaganda attacked directly into the deepest fears of the Roman populace. A deep fear of foreign influence, a fear of female political power, and a deep-seated contempt for what they thought as Hellenistic excess.
So the Roman people were told that Antony, the great general, was merely a victim, a brilliant mind corrupted by the seductive, non-Roman East.
Exactly. Octavian circulated these detailed, often completely fabricated accounts of Cleopatra's supposed debauchery, her insatiable ambition, and her complete disregard for Roman traditions. He even leveraged Caesarion, painting the child as an illegitimate threat to Rome's stability, claiming Cleopatra intended to move the Roman capital itself to Alexandria.
The genius of Octavian's move was that he made the military conflict feel like a moral crusade. He convinced Rome they were fighting for their very soul, not just for territory.
This psychological warfare was the prelude, the essential setup for the inevitable military confrontation, the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE.
Actium was the pivotal naval battle that marked the beginning of the end. Now, strategically, Antony and Cleopatra controlled a massive force, but their strategy was flawed.
It was. They chose a naval confrontation in the open sea, an area where Octavian's forces, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, were tactically superior with smaller, more nimble ships.
The battle itself quickly devolved into a tactical disaster for the alliance. We have conflicting accounts, of course, but the core event remains chilling. During the heat of the fighting, Cleopatra's fleet, consisting of 60 Egyptian ships, retreated, attempting to break through the blockade.
And critically, Mark Antony followed her. Historical sources offer different explanations for this. Was it pre-planned? A desperate attempt to save their combined treasury and leadership?
Or was it an act of sudden, inexplicable weakness driven by personal devotion? We'll never know for sure.
We won't. But regardless of the motive, the effect was immediate and catastrophic for morale. Octavian's forces instantly seized on it, presenting it as undeniable proof of Antony's slavish devotion to the bewitching queen. When the general abandons his fleet mid-battle to follow his lover, the troops lose all confidence.
It was a fatal strategic and psychological error.
Completely. The rest of their fleet soon surrendered, and the couple fled back to Alexandria.
And once they returned to Alexandria, the city that had been the foundation of Cleopatra's power, the source of her wealth, her intellect, her legitimacy, had now become their cage.
Their gilded cage as Octavian's legions laid siege.
The siege was swift. Antony's remaining forces soon abandoned him, realizing Octavian's victory was inevitable. Antony committed suicide shortly thereafter, leading to the final moments of Cleopatra's life.
And she knew exactly what awaited her if Octavian captured her alive. It wasn't going to be a quiet retirement.
And that leads us to the final, most mythologized act, the symbolic suicide involving the bite of the asp, the cobra.
And this is where we have to return to her intellectual mastery of Egyptian symbolism. Her final action was not just an emotional response to defeat. This was a final, deliberate geopolitical strategy enacted through ritual.
So the question we must always ask is, why a cobra? Of all the ways to die.
Because the uraeus, the cobra, was the ultimate symbol of Egyptian royalty, the sacred emblem worn on the brow of the pharaohs. It was the divine protector of the kingdom, the manifestation of the sun god Ra's fierce protective power.
So by choosing this specific death, she ensured that her end was not merely a way to avoid the Roman spectacle of humiliation, which would have been what?
Which would have involved being dragged in golden chains through the streets of Rome behind Octavian's triumphant chariot, a public shaming.
Her death was a final, brilliant declaration.
It was. She died not as a captive barbarian queen, but as a goddess, Isis, struck down by the sacred symbol of her own divine power. She performed a ritual that cemented her immortality as the last true pharaoh. She controlled her death, and in doing so, she dictated, or at least attempted to dictate, her own historical legacy.
She robbed Octavian of his ultimate trophy. The narrative became less about Octavian's victory over a woman in chains and more about the tragic, divine end of a powerful, unconquerable queen.
And with that final, symbolic ritual, a monumental historical watershed moment occurred. Her death marked the definitive, indisputable end of the 3,000-year history of the pharaohs.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that, an epic-ending moment of unimaginable historical weight.
And the geopolitical results were immediate and absolute. Egypt, which had been the last great independent Hellenistic kingdom, was immediately absorbed. It became a personal province of Rome, basically Octavian's private domain.
The wealth, the grain, the gold.
All of it now flowed north to solidify Octavian's power, allowing him to feed the Roman populace, pay off his legions, and ultimately transform himself into Rome's first emperor, Augustus Caesar. The very resources she had so brilliantly husbanded for Egypt's survival ended up fueling the rise of the Roman Empire.
So, after this deep dive, after stripping away 2 millennia of romantic fiction, what is the core ancient wisdom we take from Cleopatra's life? Particularly for you, the modern learner, what's the takeaway?
For me, we are left with the essential legacy, the power of the mind and the strategic application of knowledge.
That's the ultimate lesson.
That is the ultimate takeaway. She was born into a crumbling ancient dynasty facing a military behemoth, and she used her deep academic knowledge, her intellect, her training in philosophy and rhetoric, her mastery of 9 languages, and her strategic understanding of global supply chains to navigate an environment completely dominated by sheer military might and by powerful, hostile male leaders.
She was a true scholar queen. She utilized diplomacy, symbolic imagery, and economic leverage derived from her country's resources, rather than relying on legions, which she knew she couldn't match. And she nearly succeeded in reshaping the known world using soft power against the hardest military power in existence.
Consider the magnitude of the task. She took an internally divided kingdom and managed, through sheer personal brilliance and academic training, to hold off the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, not just for a decade, but for 2. Her mind was the greatest fortress she defended.
Her failure, in the end, was not a failure of intellect or strategy. but simply the result of encountering another political genius, Octavian, who was willing to deploy unparalleled propaganda and had the overwhelming momentum of the Roman military machine behind him.
The ideological pushback against the unification of East and West was simply too strong to overcome. The idea was too radical for Rome.
But her strategic genius still shines through. She understood that legitimacy, communication, and controlling the narrative were just as powerful, if not more powerful, than the point of a sword. She transformed herself into the divine focus of her country's entire resistance, a strategy that ensured her story would never, ever be forgotten.
And as we close this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought, an image to mull over tonight, one that I think perfectly symbolizes her intellectual power.
Think back to Alexandria, the jewel of the Hellenistic world. Think of the lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the ancient wonders of the world, built centuries before her reign.
That structure stood for knowledge, for engineering perfection, and it guided safe passage across chaotic, dangerous waters.
That lighthouse, casting its brilliant beam across the dark, churning Mediterranean Sea, serves as a perfect, timeless symbol of a queen who utterly refused to let her vast ancient empire fade quietly into the dark.
Instead, she chose to use her mind, her learning, and her strategic wisdom to cast a calculated, brilliant light across the chaotic seas of power, nearly blinding Rome itself in the process and earning herself an immortality Octavian could never entirely diminish.
She fought an intellectual war for the survival of her culture and her dynasty, and for 20 years she kept the greatest empire in the world at bay, using only the knowledge she acquired in that library.
A truly remarkable mind.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the strategic mind of Cleopatra VII. We hope you feel a little better informed and a lot more curious about the power of learning.
The Nile has sustained us for millennia. It will witness my end, but not my surrender.